Hello, starlings. It's been a while. I haven't been very active lately, but I wanted to at least share the creepy community's favorite holiday with you, Halloween. So in the spirit of Halloween, here's a Reddit NoSleep story collection for you to enjoy. My daughter Isabel was such a kind, beautiful girl. She was always trying to help. She started complaining about seeing things about 6 months ago. She claimed that she saw seals in the water. She had also claimed that she saw small deer playing in some scrublands. Her teacher, Miss Aguilar, said that she was telling other kids weird stories and that she had to eat lunch with her to avoid problems with the other students. Whenever we drove near a canal or waterway, which there are plenty of in Palm Beach, Florida, she would comment on the animals which no one else could see. Being 7, we assumed that she was just letting her imagination get away with her, and eventually she stopped talking about it after enough scoldings, until something bit her brother Eduardo. He had been playing in the canal in our backyard, a pretty small one, only about 2 feet deep at the deepest, when he started screaming. We thought it was Isabel, because it was so loud and high-pitched. He managed to get halfway back to the house, missing one big toe on his left foot, and some of the foot itself. The entire time at the hospital, he kept insisting that something bit him, but said he didn't see it. It wasn't until we got home a few nights later, after Ed was out of the hospital, with enough debt to buy a home and new worries about how Eduardo was going to go through life, when she told me what she had seen. Maribel, my wife, cried all night and wondered who or what would do that to an 11-year-old boy. It was a woman. She turned into a big, flat snake and waited for Ed by the water. "Okay, young lady, we're gonna have to have a talk now." Her mother took her into the bedroom and it sounded like a pretty stern talk. We decided at an early age we'd only speak English in the home, but I could hear Spanish words peppering her sentences. Despite the painkillers, Eduardo was upset enough already and wanted to know what his sister was saying. We told him she was just making up wild stories. I began to feel a pit in my stomach about what CPS might do. The next few days were some of the most difficult of my life. Isabel withdrew from us. Ed was crying every night and couldn't play with his friends and soccer anymore. Saying that it was a life-changing experience was an understatement. Maribel began crying at night and drinking wine with a little extra medication. I was afraid saying something would make it worse. Miss Aguilar came by unannounced. Apparently, Isabel was having problems in school, and she suggested after school. It made it more convenient to pick her up anyways. So we signed her up for after school despite her protests. On the other end of the spectrum, Ed decided to try and board the public bus to go to school despite needing bed rest. But life did go on. 2 months after the accident, Ed had his prosthetic, and Isabel seemed to be warming up to things again. She grew a fascination with wildlife and began reading a lot about different species, especially extinct ones. However, she never mentioned seeing animals again. Eventually, Ed even began playing some soccer again, if only to see his friends from the sidelines. His prosthetic didn't let him run very fast, but he always tried his hardest. One day, we got a call from one of the parents of Isabel's friends. "Hi, this is Cynthia Knox, Tara Knox's mother. Your daughter is at my place for a sleepover, and I'm afraid there's been an incident that the other kids found a bit disturbing. We're hoping you wouldn't mind coming over to pick up your daughter." She didn't say it angrily or as if it were life or death, but insisted that we come at once. We sped more than I'd like to admit getting there. We were both worried about a potential injury or Isabel having gotten into a fight. Embarrassment was higher up in our mind. The Knox family was very rich and lived on Palm Beach Island, cultivating a relationship with them so that Isabel would grow up around the right people to make the right connections. Sure enough, when we got there, Isabel was waiting by the door with her stuff. Miss Knox told us that she had scared her other friends while they were roasting marshmallows at the beach. She told them that she saw seals coming out of the water, which was worrying all by itself since there were none. She said that they were monk seals and that they had gone extinct, but could still come back. Apparently, she tried to warn them that she read a book that said seals are coming to the shore meant something was in the water. At first, they ignored her, but she became hysterical when one of the girls went near the water. She didn't bother going further into details. She just returned her as if she were a defective product. We apologized, mumbled something about psychiatric care, and left. The car ride home was utterly silent. We told her not to do that again and went to sleep, not knowing how to deal with two deeply ill children. We eventually talked about it. Isabel was too young to see a shrink. Neither of us completely trusted the profession. We decided to call her teacher, Miss Aguilar, for advice. She said that it was normal for little girls to make up tales, especially for attention. Isabel had been acting better and doing well in school. She advised us to spend more time with Isabel if possible. We ended up looking for a therapist anyway, a part-time professor at FAU, Mark Drenley, who we ended up visiting at his office a week later. I hope you don't mind the smell. I don't usually go full hippie, but the patchouli tends to cover the reek from the bad AC system. Before we knew it, we were drinking juniper tea and listening to funny stories about him teaching El Salvador. We were worried about his fee, but he made it surprisingly affordable for us, and we ended up scheduling an appointment for him to come to our home and talk to Isabel. We didn't tell Isabel about it, but it made the entire week go by easier. We ignored Isabel staying up late and Ed pushing himself trying to run. That Friday, we got off work a little early and brought home some carnitas and maduros and black beans, her favorite. Ed and Isabel were enjoying them thoroughly while we cleaned the place up. When it turned 7:30, I went back to the kitchen to see how the kids were doing, but they were gone. Maribel and I tore the house apart looking for them before I noticed the muddy footprints at the back door. I walked out to check. Someone had walked through the mud of the canal bank to get to our home. The same footprints had a much smaller set of footprints that seemed to go to the canal. I wanted to look further, but couldn't find my cell phone to light the way. I went to the house and told Maribel what I had seen. Her first reaction was to call the police, but she also couldn't find her phone. When we went into the kitchen, there they were. Both of the phones had been placed carefully on the chair next to where Isabel was sitting, across the table from Ed. When we opened them, a text from Mark was sitting there staring back at us. "Hey, sorry for the delay. I'm caught in traffic outside the uni. Heading straight for you, though." Someone had already read it before we did. "Oh God, where are they?" Maribel began to weep, backing away from the cell phone. "I'm going to get our kids back. Wait here and call the cops." I turned on the flashlight app and ran outside. The footsteps were easy to follow, even though it was already pitch black out. Then I went down to the bank of the canal, but didn't go into the water immediately. I ran and ran and ran, until I finally reached the area where a river had diverted into the canal to make way for a new development. The violent spray of water from the rooted river looked like a severed artery bleeding into a sterile duct. On the other side of the bank, Isabel was standing, staring at me. But she wasn't alone. Miss Aguilar stood next to my girl. She was holding Ed, whose eyes were open, but who was not conscious, as if he were lighter than a feather. She was smiling faintly. He didn't move a muscle. I didn't see it at first, but looking down there was a massive alligator. Not just massive, absurd, easily the length of a mobile home. It was almost translucent one moment, and then it wasn't. It was visible, but looked like it was some sort of graphical error in the world. Whatever you did, you just put him down. The cops are already on their way. Miss Aguilar laughed at this. That was her only reaction before dropping Ed into the bank of the river. I screamed as the gator lurched forward and clamped its massive mouth over my son. Blood sprayed out across the banks, and the monster took his motionless body before quickly moving it into his mouth. As it did so, it became more opaque. I heard it breathing and realized that before it hadn't been making any noise at all. Now it looked entirely real, and it was staring at me. With a single movement, it turned around in the small canal and seemed prepared to leap over the canal wall. I wish I could say I tried to fight somehow, to check and see if there were any chance of saving my boy or Isabel. Instead, I ran. I ran and ran and ran. I was panting by the time I got back to the house. 10 minutes later, the police were there, and Isabel and Aguilar had fled. The police claimed that Aguilar must have killed Ed while abducting Isabel. Thank God we have cameras around the neighborhood. It sounded like they were going to pin it on us at first. This was all about 4 months or so ago. Since then, I've focused on finding them. The police are useless, aside from putting out missing posters in different parts of the state. Allison Aguilar had once been an anthropologist studying the A's and the Jaga tribes that once lived in Florida, but had left little trace of her existence. But she will. A little girl and old man reported seeing a giant blue and red bird flying about their home in the Sarasota. The bird vaguely matches the description of one that went extinct shortly after the settlers arrived. I hope I can stop this one from coming back. My family home growing up was at the end of a long road on the edge of a small town. Very small. 2,600 people small. A decent-sized forest wrapped around the property, squeezing it in a dense green grasp. To the south of it went on for about 3 miles before it opened up into a local corn farmer's field. To the east and west it was only half a mile till another house could be found along the wood's perimeter. To the north, the long drive went straight through another half-mile of forest before getting to the main road. It's been about 11 years since I've been back there. Even though that home has some of the best memories from my childhood, I refuse to go anywhere near it, as it holds some of the worst memories too. I can still smell the woods to this day. Growing up, my brother and I spent so many days in those woods. We didn't live near anybody our age, so most of our free time after school and on weekends was spent wandering, exploring, pretending, and really enjoying nature. Whether it had been sledding down one of the hills in the winter, climbing the trees with a gun-shaped stick pretending to be a military sniper, or carving spears out of branches, saying one of those days we'd catch one of the rabbits that always managed to escape. It was fun. And being so young, we never realized what was actually wrong with the land, with the woods. Maybe we were just naive, or we were too busy with what we were doing that we didn't notice. On a cool day in August, right before school started back, my brother and I went out into the woods for our last excursion of the summer. We followed the stream that slithered around. We climbed the tallest hill where our fort was, and finally reached the other side, where an old oak tree sat alone. It was gigantic, so large that it must have blocked all the sun from the surrounding trees and plants, so much that there were no life around it. We decided that it was finally time we carved our name into this massive tree, as many before us seemed to have done. The previous initials carved into the tree had become probably 10 times their original size as the tree grew, healed, and permanently sealed these forgotten letters into its trunk forever. Our father came with us to this tree one time and said some of those initials must have been over 100 years old. So we remembered that and started cutting our initials into the tree, hoping they would remain there for another century for some kids to find one day. After we carved them, we set back on our journey home. It was starting to get dark. My brother and I only talked about this recently, as neither of us said anything at the time, but we both could feel something, watching us as we walked through the woods. The sound of crunching leaves, snapping twigs beneath our feet, filled the silence that lingered. But something else was there. It seemed to follow us. We finally made it back and went inside. We went about the rest of our day. Dinner, TV, bed. At the time, I wasn't so fond of it, but my brother and I shared a room, with good old-fashioned bunk beds specifically. Most nights we would stay up talking about what we were going to do the next day, while looking out the window into the darkness of the woods. That night is when it first started. My brother said he saw someone run from the front yard into the woods. I said I didn't believe him. I said it was probably just a coyote or fox running after one of the many rabbits that had inhabited the area. However, I began thinking. My brother wasn't one to lie. He always told us things, how they are. Sometimes I always respected and liked that about him. With my own worries increasing that someone was dashing into the woods, we both got up and ran into our parents' room, telling them what we saw. They were skeptical but decided to turn on the porch lights to see what was going on out there and if there was something out there. We got back to our room and looked out the window that faced the front lawn. From the window you could see the front porch itself, as it was covered by a small roof, but the front yard was decently lit, and we continued to watch, waiting to see movement. 15 minutes passed and nothing happened. I reassured my brother that it was probably just an animal and that we should go to bed. At 4 a.m., I awoke my brother crying. These were not tears I had heard him cry before. They were not tears shed from falling off a bike or losing a loved one. I could hear the fear, the fright dripping off his face, the faint whimpers of despair echoing from his mouth as he pointed out the window. While the front porch lights were still on, a shadow stretched back, flat on the ground until it became lost in the darkness, as if someone was standing on our front porch. My brother whispers that he had been watching out the window the whole time and saw the figure sprint from the woods and stop at our front porch. The shadow has not moved since. I looked at the shadow being and felt my legs lock up. I couldn't breathe. It felt like someone had knocked the wind out of me. But why? It was only a shadow. We quietly made our way back to our parents' room for the second time, telling them what we saw. My father grabbed the loaded .45 he kept in his nightstand and walked down the stairs. My mom grabbed my brother and I, and we waited as my father checked outside. We heard him open the front door, and quicker than expected, the door was slammed, and the click of the lock echoed up the stairs. Then pounding on the door, so loud and so powerful that I could feel the floor beneath me vibrating after each hit. My mother ran down the stairs, thinking my father got locked out. We followed her only to see my dad with his eyes closed, holding the door shut. My mom began to speak, and he quickly put a finger over his mouth and made it clear he wanted us to be quiet. It sounded as if any second now the door was going to break down, as if someone was on the other side wailing at it with a sledgehammer. Then suddenly it stopped. My father waited 5 minutes before saying anything and quickly looked about the peephole to see if anything was there. He took us all back upstairs and said it was nothing, just an animal trying to find food. We knew he was lying. He could probably sense that we knew too, but that's what he said, and he stuck to his story. The night was quiet from then on. but neither I nor my brother slept. After school the next day, we decided to go out into the woods, as we usually do. For some reason, my brother suggested we go back to the letter tree, that big oak covered in initials. We walked through the forest, but something felt off, even more so than before. The trees were all darker. The steam that we followed had dried up. For the first time we'd ever seen, we paid no attention to it and kept following the stream that had dried up along the tree. My brother stopped in his tracks and I knew something was off. I was a few yards behind him and I had chased one of the elusive bunnies with my homemade spear. But it was just like the night before. I could feel his fear. I caught up and asked him what he was looking at, and he pointed to the tree. It was still a little far off, but close enough that it was entirely in view. He refused to go closer to the tree. I couldn't see what he was pointing at, and he could hardly speak, so I went by myself to go check out what had spooked him so much. As I approached the tree, I could smell something that I never smelled before. I can't really describe the smell. I don't even want to try. When I reached the tree, I finally realized what my brother saw. The body of a woman dangling from a thick rope. Her stomach had bloated and burst, leaving bits of entrails on the ground beneath. The rope had ripped through her throat, pushing the skin off her neck towards her head, leaving a gap where the muscles and spinal column were visible. Blood stained the front of her blouse. I can still to this day smell the rotting flesh. I can still see the hole in her body, the bugs crawling all around, feasting on her carcass. I ran home with my brother to tell her parents what we saw. They quickly called the police and explained what we found. They sent over a couple of patrol cars to investigate, and we watched as they ventured out into the woods. About half an hour later, they came back and explained that they didn't find anything, but continued asking for details. We told them everything we could remember, including the type of clothing she had on, the color of her hair, as well as how badly decomposed the body was. As we explained in detail, our dad's face turned from anxious to shocked. Then he walked back into the house. The police left and said they would be in touch, and my mom walked my brother and I back inside. Our dad was sitting at the kitchen table with a bottle of bourbon open and freely flowing. We asked him why he looked so shocked all of a sudden, and he told us that the woman we described was the one banging on the door the night before. He felt so horrified that maybe he could have helped her from committing suicide if only he had opened the door, that maybe she just needed help. We told him there is no way. Her body looked like it had been hanging there for days, if not a week or more, but he swore it was the same woman. A week went by since we saw the body out there. We wouldn't go near the tree, but the smell of her rotting flesh still lingered and was spreading, so much so that we could no longer go into the woods. We received a call from the police. They said that many years ago, back in 1931, this currently was 1989, a woman went missing from the town. It wasn't until 1968 one of the previous owners of the house called the police because a skeleton was hanging from a tree in the woods. Turns out she had hung herself and completely decomposed out in that forest, spending over 55 years there. Little did we know that over 12 families had moved in and out of the house pretty quickly since 1968 due to bad smells in the area, random banging on the front door, and apparently a younger child from a previous family said he saw a woman building a really high swing. We moved out the next month. Every single morning, Jerry Richards gets up at 6:30 sharp, makes breakfast for his wife Debbie and their 2-year-old son Lucas, usually scrambled eggs and bacon. but today is a special day for 2 reasons. However, Jerry is only aware of one of these reasons. It's Lucas' birthday today, so Jerry makes his son's favorite, chocolate chip pancakes with whipped cream on top. After breakfast, Jerry will leave for work. He will ruffle Lucas's hair and give Debbie a kiss on the cheek. It's a Friday, so Debbie will ask Jerry to stop at the grocery store on the way home and pick up a gallon of milk and 2 dozen eggs. Jerry will nod dutifully as she reminds him that he forgot the eggs last time. Jerry will walk out the back door into his car. Jerry will leave the back door unlocked, as he always does. Then Jerry will get into his 2012 Honda Civic with 2/3 of a tank of gas left and go to work. The drive will take 13 to 17 minutes depending on traffic. When Jerry passes the intersection of 3rd and Main Street, he will think nothing of it as usual. Jerry won't remember driving along that road 17 years ago. Jerry won't remember the beers he had that night before he tried to drive home. Jerry certainly won't remember when he plowed into a minivan carrying a young couple and their baby. Jerry's father, Robert Richards, was a powerful judge back then. Jerry was a young, handsome, smart boy with his whole life ahead of him. Robert wouldn't allow one little drunk driving accident to undo that. No, that would have been cruel, unfair to his perfect son. Instead, Jerry got off with community service and a slap on the wrist. Jerry forgot about that night a long time ago. Jerry thinks that everyone forgot about that night a long time ago. Jerry never would think that someone could remember that happened 17 years later. Jerry would never think that the young father driving the car he crashed into would wait 17 years for Jerry to have a family of his own, a baby boy of his own. Jerry Richards drives to work, never thinking that the same man might be slowly walking into his home right now through the back door that Jerry never seems to remember to lock. Jerry would never think that very same man could carry enough rage and hate for so long that he would hurt a woman and child. Jerry would never think that he might come home tonight to the same nightmare that very same man has lived every night for the past 17 years. Jerry Richards will leave work at 6 p.m. sharp, make the 13 to 17 minute drive home. He will stop for milk, forgetting the eggs again. Jerry will walk into his house at 6:30 p.m. And then Jerry will never forget that night 17 years ago, ever again. I cannot remember a time that my gran has not lived in an old age home. She was born in 1938 and survived the Great Depression. Had kind of a tough childhood, helping to raise her 12 siblings. Her adult life wasn't any rosier. She was married to an alcoholic and had to work long shifts to provide for her 4 children all by herself. Life has made her bitter, but I don't blame her. She used to love reading and crossword puzzles, but her eyes are really bad now and she just basically sleeps her day away. We had her move into a new home recently. The center is close to the children, so we can visit her more often, and it's not too far for her to take a trip in the car. She has a bad back, so she can't stay in a seated position too long. Once she had settled in, we decided to visit her in the home. I took my son so he could meet his great-grandmother. She seemed fairly happy with the new arrangements. She looked very well. When I asked her what she had been doing differently, she just shrugged off her new health as a new diet. I saw several residents that day, and they all seemed fairly lively for geriatrics. Lunch for them is served at 12 o'clock on the dot. The residents, my gran included, shuffled their walkers eagerly into the mess hall. Visitors are encouraged to share meals with their grandparents or elderly parents, so we shuffled behind them. I was surprised at their lunch. We pay quite a hefty amount every month for what we're promised was world-class care, 3 meals a day. My gran sat in front of a bowl of some weird-looking gloop, some sort of porridge, I guess. We excused ourselves after grace and waited for Gran to finish her lunch. She came back an hour later. She had arranged for the cook to wrap up some of the porridge. I told her that we would eat it later, but she insisted. It was disgusting. It tasted oddly savory, and it had some weird reddish color. I struggled to keep it down. My son flat out refused to eat it. We stayed for a couple hours after lunch, and we headed home. I couldn't get that weird taste out of my mouth. We had a normal family night in. My son wakes up very early on the weekends. He usually grabs a bowl of cereal and watches cartoons until I wake up. That morning I woke at 4 a.m. I had this inexplicable energy. I started cleaning, make my son a decent breakfast of omelet and bacon and pancakes. The house was spotless when he got up. That week, work went great. This energy seemed to just last all week long, but ran out by Saturday. Weird thing is, I didn't eat all week, but I had so much energy. My gran called me Saturday morning and asked if we would visit her again. We happily accepted. We arrived during their lunchtime. I could smell the porridge when we entered the mess hall. This time I ate 2 bowls without flinching and happily accepted the wrapped up containers with leftovers. I was feeling great. I noticed during our visit that there were fewer residents. It seemed that 4 residents had passed away during the week. None of the other residents seemed too upset. During that visit, we kept hearing weird sounds, almost like saws. There were no signs of construction when we entered the premises, but Gran didn't offer any explanation when I asked her about the sounds. Anyway, I got home, had some of the gloop they gave me, and had a normal week. Almost normal. Again, another 2 weeks went by during which I just didn't eat. I put in extra hours at work, spring cleaned the house twice, took my son to the zoo and museums and the park, as if I was trying to fit in every single parent-child activity into one weekend. Then I got the call. Gran had passed away. The family rushed to the home. We had to collect her belongings, make funeral arrangements. We're all confused. Sure, she was old, but she seemed so healthy and lively when we last saw her. My uncle went to view her body. He came back upset. Something isn't right. It's like some of her body just didn't have any bones left. A few weeks after the funeral, I got a call from my uncle. He contacted the police to investigate my gran's death. A lot of the findings are kept under wraps. Many people of my culture are raised on the principle of want not, waste not. It used to be a common practice for farmers to feed their livestock bone meal. This is made by grinding the bones of carcasses and making some type of flour, which is then mixed with normal animal feed. The practice was banned in the early 90s in my country. I think I ate someone's grandparent. I've been living in an apartment with my girlfriend for around 7 months now, and I've grown really fond of the place. It's the one place where I truly feel like I'm home for the first time, given the fact that it's spacious enough and in a good location. I practically don't need to walk more than 2 minutes to reach anything I need in my street. Store, bakery, gym, clinic, you name it. But that's only the icing on the cake. What makes me truly feel at home is the fact that I'm with my girlfriend and I no longer have the feeling of being in a temporary place, so to say. I guess that's what they mean when they say home is where the heart is. Anyway, I work as a freelancer, which means I spend the majority of the day inside the apartment. I have a tiny room which I use as an office, and to the left of my desk is a window that overlooks the parking lot to the apartment complex and adjacent buildings. Now, I don't really look out the window since there's nothing particularly interesting to see. I live on the second floor, and from where I sit, I can only see a 2-story building across the view. However, if I crane my head enough to move my chair to the right position, I can see the window of the building across, and during the night I can see clearly inside the room. Usually I would see some colorful cutouts of paper letters hanging around and a bunch of kids with one woman who was supposedly their mentor, but I never once gave it a second thought or longer glance. It would be kind of weird. I pass by that building every day when I go to the gym, and I can see illustrations of children on the wall with the name Our Games Daycare Center and Playroom. So, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to figure out what that building is for. I would see the teacher occasionally outside as well, but since the lights in my room are always off, she probably never saw me, so I never bothered to say hi to her. Like I said, I never paid too much attention to it. That was until about a week ago, that is. It all started one night when I had a particularly busy day. It was around 8 p.m. in the evening, and I was catching up on some work. I leaned against my chair to stretch my back and peered out into the window. Amid the darkness across the complex, I saw the window glowing in a bright white light. In the few seconds of glancing at it, I saw some kids running around in a gyrating motion with one adult woman, the teacher. The kids' faces were covered in red paint, so I'm just assuming they were playing some games and possibly dancing or singing or whatever. I found the whole thing uninteresting, so I returned to my work for the rest of the night. The next night, when I was working, I looked out the window again and saw the daycare center being active. Only this time I could only see one kid standing in the room, facing away from the window. He is motionless with his arms above his head, as if he were holding something above, but I saw nothing in his hands. After about half a minute of staring, the kid put his hands down and hunched forward, rubbing his shoulders, clearly motioning that his muscles hurt. Almost immediately, the teacher came into view and bent down so that her face was closer to the kid's. She gestured something which looked like she was scolding him, but I just wrote it off as her reminding him of the rules or giving him a command or something. After a brief exchange, the kid raised his arms back up again and the teacher disappeared out of view. I figured they were playing some kind of game in which the kids had to be still until a command was given, since I remember playing something similar as a kid. I was perplexed by the whole thing though, since it seemed a little harsh on the kids. However, the notification on my laptop snapped me back into reality and I returned to my work, completely displacing the daycare out of my mind. The next day is when things started to get weird. Again, I leaned back in my chair and saw the lights of the daycare center. This time, however, I saw a bunch of kids gathered around a table with the teacher in the forefront. I could see her smiling, but the expression on the kids' faces couldn't be more opposite. The few that I saw looked scared to death as their gazes were transfixed on the teacher. Still smiling, she uttered something and raised an index finger. Next, she started pointing at the children one by one very slowly, going in circles. The kids looked terrified at this point, and I'm pretty sure I saw one of them cry. It didn't take me long to realize that the teacher was playing Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo. The moment seemed to last forever, and I felt as if I were among those kids out there, holding my breath the entire time. She slowed down the final few counts, retaining her finger on each child for a few seconds before moving on to the next one. Each time she would do that, I thought that it was one of the child that she chose, but then she would count another time, and another, and then she did stop. She held her index in front of one of the boys with a wide grin on her face. Then she lowered her hand and said something, after which almost immediately all the other kids dispersed out of view, leaving only the teacher and the chosen kid. She stood over him menacingly. The boy looked up at her and was shivering. The teacher bent down on the side to pick up something, and a moment later she placed something black on the desk. I could see from here that it was a very tiny kitten, moving against the teacher's hand trustingly as she pet it. The kitten walked over to the kid, who was petting it gently, but the expression of fear didn't dissipate from his face. Then the teacher bent down again to reach for something else, and when she got back up, she placed a shiny object on the desk. I'm sure you can guess what it was, for I did as soon as I saw the glint. A kitchen knife. At this point my heart was pounding, and the kid started crying as the knife was slid across the table towards him. As he cradled the kitten in his arms, close to his chest, he shook his head, not looking away from the animal that trusted him completely. But the teacher started yelling at him, taking an even more threatening pose. The kid was sobbing now, but he slowly took up the knife with trembling hands and placed the endearing kitten on the desk. He then raised the knife above his head and held it there, while continuing to sob. The teacher shouted something at him again, and despite knowing what would happen next, it still surprised me and shocked me to my core. The kid stabbed at the kitten while holding the eyes tightly closed. When he was finally done, he dropped the knife. He looked at the mess on the table. He was covered in blood as the teacher stood there with her arms on her hips, no longer menacing, but rather smiling and triumphant. She gestured to the other kids to gather around, and as they did, she smeared the dead kitten's blood over each of their faces, after which they started to dance around like they did a few nights prior to that. I felt sick. It took my brain a while to process what I was seeing. The kids, although seemingly happy dancing from behind, had a palatable fear on their faces. The next thing I knew, light came on in my room as my girlfriend walked in with a stern, "What are you doing?" question. I quickly shushed her and told her to turn the lights off, but it was too late. The teacher had already seen the lights come on, and she was staring at me, motionless, with a face that had no expression or emotion whatsoever. I quickly ducked down below the window as the lights went out again, and my confused girlfriend stood by the door, asking me what was going on in a hushed tone. I motioned for her to approach, but to stay out of the line of sight. I tried to explain to her what was going on, but she wasn't buying any of it. I've been pranking her too much in the past now, so she didn't believe me. I told her to look, but she only remarked that it was just a normal daycare. To my amazement, when I looked over there, it indeed seemed like they were just doing normal things. There's no blood anywhere, no dead animals. Just the kids and the teacher doing something by the desks. My girlfriend dismissed my claims and went to bed, smirking along the way, still convinced that this was just another prank. As she left, I turned on my cell phone and put it by the window, and pointed it to the daycare center to record while I remained below, out of sight. After a while, nothing surreal happened, and the parents arrived to pick up their children. They appeared to be conversing with the teacher, and the children themselves behaved normally. I should have called the police then and there, but truth be told, I questioned my own sanity, and if I had just imagined the whole thing. Is it possible that this was just some sort of game, and the kids were playing and just acting, that killing the kitten was just some sort of a really well-prepared, realistic act? As the parents left with their kids, the teacher turned off the lights, and that was that. I waited a few minutes before actually stopping the recording. I peered out the window, convinced I was in the clear. I finished up work that night, trying to forget the whole thing, and double-checked if every window and door in my apartment had been locked that night. Then I sat down in the living room and replayed the video I recorded. I prayed to God that the children were indeed not subject to any more ruthless acts of violence that I had potentially missed while recording. Sure enough, the children seemed to only be engaged in normal playroom activities. And then the parents came, talked to the teacher, picked up their kids and left, after which the room went dark. I continued staring at the video of the dark window, relieved that I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. But as I kept staring, the more I got this nagging feeling that I was missing something. I replayed the video again from the part when the lights go out, and still nothing. And then I played it one more time and paused it midway. It made shivers run down my spine. There, in the window frame, stood a dark figure. Unmistakably, it was the teacher. She just stood there doing nothing, facing directly towards the camera, arms slumped next to her body, head tilted slightly. I replayed it over and over, trying to convince myself it was just the dark and my bad camera, making it seem like someone was there. But the more I reviewed it, the more it became clear that someone was indeed there, motionless during those few minutes until the video ended. I ran back to my working room and looked out the window again. The lights were on again and I could see clearly into the daycare center. There were colorful paper cutouts in the window, arranged to form a message. The message simply read, "Watch." I didn't wait a second longer. I dialed the police and told them everything that was going on. In a matter of minutes, they arrived and searched the place, questioning me in the process. Apparently, the woman that had been running the daycare center was gone. Her apartment was empty and she was nowhere to be found. The kids didn't say anything either, claiming the teacher was always friendly and kind and that they really enjoyed the activities she made them do. But the officers swear that they could see the fear in the kids' eyes whenever they asked them about what happened. Despite finding the mutilated kitten, none of them seemed to want to talk about the ordeal and deny that any such activities took place there. The police have placed a unit to patrol the street out of fear she might retaliate against me. It's been a week since then, and I don't know if the daycare center is still active or not. In fact, I keep the curtains closed on my window, too afraid to look outside. Afraid that if I look, I would see the children playing with the teacher. Afraid that I would see more helpless animals or worse get killed. And most of all, afraid that if I peer through my window, I will see that sinister face looking back at me.